Greed often wears a suit, speaks softly, and underestimates anyone who doesn't. In the quiet town of Pinefield, a patch of land at the edge of the map became the center of a storm, because the man who tended it didn't fold when threatened. A wealthy developer saw an elderly black man, worn by time and clinging to a patch of dirt. He never imagined the man in muddy boots had once led missions behind enemy lines. When hired men crossed that fence and spilled blood, they didn't just start a war. They woke something far more dangerous. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Morning came slow and warm over the Briggs farm. The sun spilled like honey across tilled earth, bathing the rows of vegetables in gold. Tomato vines curled up toward the sky, thick and ripe. Corn stood proud, tassels waving in the breeze. Chickens scratched busily around the coop, pecking at scattered seed. Goats bleated from the paddock, crowding near the fence as laughter rose in the distance. Children were running again. Every Saturday they came, sneakers kicking up dirt, backpacks flung aside, arms wide open. They charged through the open gate with the same breathless excitement city kids reserve for roller coasters and Christmas mornings. Eli Briggs stood under the old pecan tree at the center of the yard. His back was bowed, not by weakness, but by time. 72 years had etched themselves across his frame with stubborn permanence, but his eyes, sharp and watchful, had never dulled. "Hold the bucket steady now," he said quietly, kneeling beside a small boy with shaggy hair and a gap-toothed grin. The boy nodded seriously, gripping the tin bucket full of feed, while Eli poured from a sack. "Goats'll nip if you play around. You let them come to you." Sure enough, the goats came, hungry, impatient, crowding with cheerful chaos. The boy giggled, then shrieked when one stood on hind legs and headbutted the bucket. Eli chuckled once, low and deep. He didn't speak unless he had to. The land did enough talking for him. A small group of girls wandered over to the garden rows, trailing their fingers along the broad leaves. Eli's hand went up like a signal flag. "Stop." He walked over, picked up a basket, and pointed to a cluster of strawberries. "You pick with both hands. Be gentle." They nodded, eyes wide. He crouched beside them and picked one himself, showing them how to check for ripeness. A breeze passed, and the air filled with the scent of earth and sun-ripened fruit. Over near the barn, someone was crying. A toddler had tripped in the dirt and scraped a knee. Eli didn't rush. He walked slowly, calmly, pulling a handkerchief from his back pocket. He crouched beside her, cleaned the blood, and said nothing as he tied a soft knot above the cut. The crying stopped. She sniffled. He ruffled her hair once, then stood. By noon, most of the children had been picked up. The sun climbed higher, and the farm grew quiet. Eli stood on the porch, watching dust settle where feet once ran. He nodded once, then turned toward the far end of the garden, where the rose bush stood. It was wild now, but still full, a tangled burst of red and pink, blooming despite its age. He knelt before it slowly, grunting as his knees hit the dirt. His fingers brushed the petals, careful not to snap them. A warm wind passed, and his eyes fluttered. For a moment, Marlene was there. She stood barefoot in the soil, a basket on her arm, humming something old and sweet. Her gray hair was braided down her back, eyes shining as she plucked weeds from between the stems. She smiled at him, as if she always knew he was watching. Then the breeze shifted. The illusion faded. The garden was silent again. Eli stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic pill bottle, shook out two, and swallowed them dry. Back at the house, the phone rang. a sharp sound in the quiet. He stared at it. Unknown number. It rang again, then stopped. He turned away. On the counter, an opened letter sat under an old coffee mug. Boone Group Acquisition Proposal was stamped in bold letters across the top. The pages beneath offered numbers, phrases like generational wealth, final opportunity, and cooperative development. At the bottom was a signature. Jasper Boone. The letter had been there for 2 weeks. He didn't touch it. Instead, he walked outside, toward the barn. The sun had begun to dip behind the trees. Shadows stretched across the pens and fences. A lone cow stood in the pasture, large, brown, with soft eyes that followed him as he approached. "Hey there, girl," he murmured, lifting the gate latch. "You hungry?" She let out a low, contented sound as he reached her with the pail. He poured slowly, patting her shoulder with weathered hands. "Lady B," he said softly, "they sure loved you today." He leaned against the post as she chewed. His face was still, carved from something harder than time. Behind him, the sky turned lavender and gold. He waited until she finished, then gave her one last pat. The barn door creaked shut behind him as he turned the key in the lock. Silence returned to the fields. Only the wind and the soft clink of the metal pail followed him home. The next Monday morning brought more than the dew. Eli was in the garden early, his knees pressing into damp earth as he trimmed the browning leaves off the squash. The air still held the softness of dawn, and the sky was the kind of hazy blue that promised a hot day to come. The rooster had long since done its job, and the goats were already kicking up dust, jostling for their morning feed. He worked in quiet rhythm, pausing now and then to stretch his back or wipe a streak of sweat from his brow with the crook of his arm. The sound of tires on gravel didn't belong. Eli looked up slowly, hand resting on the handle of his garden hoe. A sleek black SUV rolled up the dirt drive, too clean for this place, windows tinted, humming low like a thing trying too hard not to roar. Behind it followed a silver Cadillac, polished, spotless, soulless. 2 doors opened at once. From the SUV stepped a man with a leather briefcase and a buttoned-up look that didn't breathe much. Tall, white, young, and tightly wound. He looked at the dirt like it might stain his inheritance. The Cadillac door opened slower, more deliberately. Jasper Boone emerged with the theatrical poise of a man who'd convinced himself he deserved the world and everything under it. Boone was handsome in the way snakes are, sharp-lined, sun-tanned, expensive. His sport coat hung off his shoulders just right, and his smile was wide enough to hide the rot behind it. His boots were clean, his watch was gold, and the only thing dirtier than his shoes was the man walking behind him. Billy Ray Crowder came up from the passenger side, dragging a lazy limp in his left leg, and a black cowboy hat that hadn't seen a real cow in its life. Tattoos ran like vines down his neck, fading into the collar of a torn flannel shirt. His mouth twisted with contempt the moment he looked at the barn. "Mr. Briggs," Boone called cheerfully, as if they were old friends meeting for brunch. He walked forward with arms slightly open, palms exposed in that well-rehearsed posture of the harmless businessman. "Pleasure to meet you in person. Been wanting to get a look at this place with my own eyes." Eli stood but didn't move closer. He brushed the dirt from his knees and adjusted his hat, eyes narrowing just slightly as the trio approached. "Didn't know this was a show farm," Eli said, voice even, roughened by years of use, but calm in the way creeks run deep beneath still water. Boone laughed like he appreciated the joke, though his eyes said he didn't. The lawyer stood beside him, already pulling papers from the briefcase. Crowder stood a few feet back, arms crossed, chewing something with loud indifference. "This land," Boone began, gesturing broadly, "has incredible potential. And I mean that sincerely, sir. The proximity to town, the acreage, your charming barn. It's the kind of space people are desperate for these days. We're looking at developing a boutique RV resort, fully green certified, locally branded. It'll bring jobs, foot traffic, and, frankly, a serious return on investment. Eli didn't answer. His eyes moved from Boone to Crowder, who just spit something into the grass with a smirk, then settled back on the papers being laid out on the makeshift table the lawyer had set up near the porch. Boone continued, unfazed. We're prepared to offer you $600,000 up front, plus residuals from naming rights if you're interested in a partnership model. Honestly, for someone your age, it's a retirement most folks would kill for. Eli took a step forward, hands tucked in the pockets of his work pants. His gaze lowered, scanning the legalese on the top page without reaching for it. This farm, he said slowly, voice gravel thick, ain't for profit. It ain't for branding. It feeds more than stomachs. There's kids that come here to remember what it feels like to breathe without fear. I'm not interested in turning that into a weekend theme park for people who think chickens lay fried eggs. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Boone's smile faltered just a fraction. Crowder chuckled, spat again. I'm guessing that's a no, then. Boone glanced at him, annoyed, then back to Eli. You don't have to make this difficult. I get that you're proud of what you've built here. But things change, Mr. Briggs. Neighborhoods grow. People evolve. You don't want to be the one holding back progress just because you've got a sentimental attachment to— He gestured vaguely at the barn, the fields, the crooked fence, all this. Eli looked down at the papers once more, then turned his back on the table. He walked slowly toward the barn, saying nothing until he reached the post where his dog, Samson, lay watching from the shade. He turned slightly, just enough to catch Boone's eye. Progress don't need to pave over peace. Samson let out a low, steady growl as Crowder stepped forward. Boone gave a tight smile and reached out to touch the lawyer's arm. Let's not waste the man's time. Boone gathered the papers, tapped them into order, and slid them back into the briefcase. As he turned to leave, he stopped and looked back. His tone dipped in syrup and poison. Hope your goodwill's worth more than a retirement, old man. Because this town's changing, with or without your blessing. Eli didn't respond. He knelt beside Samson, scratching the dog behind the ear as the vehicles rolled back down the drive. The tires spat dust into the air, and the farm grew quiet again, except for the rustling of wind through corn and the rhythmic cluck of chickens. That night, Eli sat at the kitchen table with a leather-bound journal open before him. His handwriting was tight and deliberate, filling the page line by line. The soft scratch of the pen was the only sound in the room. Beside the journal sat a half-finished mug of coffee and a rusted tin box. He opened the box after he finished writing. Inside were the medals: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. Folded beside them, yellowed and worn, were photographs, young men in uniform, arms slung around each other. One picture, dog-eared and creased, showed a younger Eli and Marlene standing beside a Humvee, his hand resting gently on her hip, both of them smiling like the war couldn't reach them here. He closed the box and returned it to the drawer beneath the sink. Outside, night settled over the fields. The land, for now, still belonged to the quiet. 2 weeks slipped by with the heat climbing higher each day, the air thick with that heavy southern stillness that made even the cicadas drag their wings. The kids still came by that first Saturday, smaller in number but no less eager, and Eli had guided them through the same routines, feeding the goats, picking strawberries, listening more than he spoke. But the laughter had felt more distant than before, like it was echoing from the far end of a tunnel. Something hung in the air, like a storm that hadn't decided if it wanted to break. He'd kept his routine tight, just the way he always had. Wake with the sun, check the fences, feed the animals, tend the earth. But every morning, The weight had grown a little heavier in his bones, like the land was holding its breath along with him. Then came the morning when the world stopped moving. It was just after 5. The horizon hadn't cracked open yet, and the fields were cloaked in that blue-gray hush that only exists before dawn. Eli stepped out with a pail in one hand and the back of his shirt damp with sleep sweat. The porch creaked the same way it always did. The ground felt the same beneath his boots, but the silence wasn't right. The goats didn't call out. The rooster didn't crow. The chickens were still. He froze halfway down the steps, eyes narrowing as his dog let out a whimper from behind the screen door. He moved faster then, his limp forgotten, the pail dropped in the dirt without a sound. He crossed the yard in long, determined strides and reached the barn before the full horror unfolded. The first thing he saw was blood. Not streaks, not drops, pools. It smeared the walls like someone had painted with their fists. It darkened the hay, turned the ground beneath the stalls to rust. The chickens, all of them, lay in a tangled mess of feathers and broken wings, their bodies twisted unnaturally. The goats had been stabbed multiple times, left where they'd slept, their eyes still wide with fear and confusion. Eli didn't make a sound. His breath hitched once, but he kept moving. He crossed the paddock, boots sinking into the damp soil, past the pen where the rabbits used to be. Cages slashed open, bodies nowhere in sight. He stepped through the pasture, heart pounding now, the silence growing more violent with every step. That was where he found her. Lady B, his last cow, his Marlene's favorite. She lay just past the maple tree, stretched on her side like she had simply lain down for a nap. Her eyes were glassy, her mouth slack. Blood pooled beneath her rib cage, already thickening in the dirt. Eli dropped to one knee beside her, hand shaking as he touched her flank. She was still warm. He stayed there a long time, not moving, not crying, just breathing through it, 1 second at a time, like a man waiting for a heartbeat that wasn't going to come. The barn door behind him was spray-painted in thick red letters, the kind that dripped down the wood as if the paint itself couldn't stand to be part of the message. One word, a slur so ugly it seemed to vibrate in the morning light. He didn't touch it. Instead, he walked back to the house in silence. He didn't call the police. He didn't tell the neighbors. He didn't scream or break things or pour himself a drink like a man in a movie might have done. He just went into the shed, pulled out his old shovel, and started digging. The soil fought him with every inch. It clung to his boots and sucked at the steel like it wanted him to give up. His shoulders burned and the sweat soaked his back, and still he dug. One grave at a time. One for each animal. One for each life that had made the farm feel like something more than just land. He whispered over every one. Some he named aloud. Some he just laid down in the dirt and covered in silence. His prayers weren't long or pretty, just fragments of words he wasn't sure he believed anymore, wrapped in breath and soil and sweat. By the time the sun was overhead, his knees were trembling and his hands blistered raw. Blood streaked across his arms from the goat's horns, and dirt had caked under his fingernails. He didn't notice. He didn't care. Later, as dusk settled low and the crickets took over the evening shift, Eli sat by the rose bush. He lit an old lantern and carried it carefully across the field to the last grave, Lady B's. The light flickered as he set it gently down beside her mound, casting long shadows that danced across the grass. He stood there for a long while, eyes on the flame. A memory rose, slow and warm. Marlene was laughing, holding a baby goat in her arms, its little hooves flailing while she tried to kiss the top of its head. Her eyes crinkled at the corners the way they always did when she smiled at something she loved. "This land's yours, Elle," she'd said back then, holding the goat like it was a child. Make it something they'll never forget. The wind passed through the trees, whispering secrets only the soil remembered. That night, the porch light glowed amber in the dark. Eli sat in his wooden rocking chair, rifle resting across his knees like an old friend come to visit. His thermos steamed gently beside him, coffee untouched. The dog curled at his feet, but didn't sleep. The slur on the barn was still there, bleeding down the wood in silence. Eli didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the horizon, waiting. 3 days passed since the graves had been filled. The lantern still burned each night, flickering in the dark, as if guarding the dead from above. Eli hadn't touched the spray-painted barn door, hadn't scraped it or painted over it. He let it stand, raw, unhidden, a mark left not just on wood, but on memory. He didn't want to forget. Not this time. The grief had settled into him, not loud or violent, but thick and constant, like humidity after the rain. It followed him into the garden, wrapped itself around his shoulders as he sat with Samson on the porch, watching the wind lean through the fields. But grief doesn't stay quiet forever, not when it's fed by something deeper. It was a strange sort of anger that began to take root, not fire-hot and explosive like the kind he'd known in combat, but slow, exacting, cold as forged steel. It wasn't born just from loss, but from what he'd come to understand in the silence, that this wasn't random. This was calculated. It was punishment, a message, and messages could be returned. He hadn't lived through 3 tours and a dozen classified operations to die quiet on his own land. He'd taken down men with more power than Boone and seen worse than Crowder lurking in jungles where the air tasted like blood. What they'd done wasn't just a crime. It was a declaration, one they didn't think would be answered. But they were wrong. He spent his days methodically, fixed the garden fence, checked his traps, cleaned the rifle, oiled his revolver, tied knots he hadn't used since Panama. His movements weren't rushed, just careful, deliberate, the kind of preparation only a man who'd already survived death could understand. And then they came back. It was dusk again when the dust rose on the horizon. Not 1 car this time, but 3. The same black SUV, the same silver Cadillac, and behind them a rust-red pickup that rattled with every bump in the road. Eli watched from his porch, motionless, the brim of his hat tilted low, the rifle still beside him but untouched. For now, the vehicles pulled up and killed their engines, and the heat that lingered in the evening seemed to rise with them. Crowder stepped out first, chewing on a toothpick, walking with that same lazy arrogance like he owned the place. 2 others followed, younger, twitchier, eyes that moved too fast. Boone didn't bother getting out this time. He sat in the Cadillac, door open, one arm resting on the window like he was waiting for a waiter at some backwoods country club. Crowder strode halfway up the path, hands loose at his sides, and smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, look at that," he said, glancing around. "You're still here. Thought maybe you'd finally gotten wise and packed it in. Smart men know when to walk away." Eli said nothing, only watched. Crowder gestured toward the barn with his chin, still defaced, the words scarring the wood in broad daylight. "We were trying to be clear last time. Maybe too subtle." The younger thug to his right laughed, a jittery sound that didn't carry far. "See? We're here now to make sure there ain't no confusion," Crowder went on, stepping closer, voice dipped in the kind of fake friendliness that turned your stomach. "You stayin' here? That tells us you didn't get the message. Or worse, you didn't care. And that, old man, is dangerous thinking." Eli slowly rose from the rocking chair, his body stiff but his presence solid. He didn't reach for the rifle. He didn't need to. His stance alone was answer enough. "You already took everything but this house," he said, voice like gravel and thunder. "And you're thinking about taking that too?" Crowder spread his arms like a preacher. "Not just thinking, promising. You'll be lucky if this place is still standing come next week. And if you're still sitting on this porch, well, we might have to do more than just scare your animals." Behind him, one of the younger men cracked his knuckles, grinning. Eli's eyes didn't flicker, didn't blink, didn't even breathe deep. He just stepped down the porch stairs, slow and heavy, until he was only a few feet from Crowder. His voice dropped, not in volume, but in temperature. "You think this land makes me old? Makes me slow? You think just 'cause I'm quiet, I'm soft?" Crowder's grin twitched, just slightly. Eli leaned forward, his face close enough for Crowder to smell the iron on his breath. "I've buried better men than you without breaking a sweat." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then Eli turned his back and walked back up the steps, calm as sunrise, and sat again in his chair. This time he rested the rifle across his lap, not pointing, not raising it, just showing. Crowder stood there for a beat too long before letting out a sharp, forced laugh. "You got balls, I'll give you that." He spat on the porch steps, but his boots didn't move any closer. He glanced back at Boone, who still hadn't stepped out of the car. Boone gave a small wave, like a man dismissing a waiter who got the order wrong. Crowder signaled the others and turned. "We'll be back," he said over his shoulder. "Next time, it won't be words." Eli didn't answer. The cars rolled away as the sun dropped behind the tree line, long shadows stretching across the yard, like arms reaching for something they couldn't quite grab. Eli sat there long after the taillights disappeared, the sky deepening to indigo above him. He reached beside the chair and picked up his old field pack, tucked beneath a tarp. Inside was a map of the surrounding woods, a knife in its leather sheath, and a roll of paracord he hadn't touched in years. He checked the rifle's chamber, then set it back down. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry in the way people expect when they hear about revenge. What he felt was colder, deeper, like the calm inside the eye of a hurricane. Night arrived with no wind, only heat and waiting. The cicadas had gone quiet early, the kind of silence that didn't come from sleep but from fear. Even the air felt different, as if it were pulling back in anticipation. The moon hung low and bloated behind a veil of clouds, bleeding pale light over the fields that had once been alive with children's laughter and the shuffling of hooves. Now it was a graveyard wearing a mask of soil and grass, and Eli Briggs sat in the shadows of his porch like a statue cut from old wood and harder memories. He had seen it in their eyes the day before. The arrogance was still there, but under it, something had shifted. That sliver of uncertainty. That pause in Crowder's step. That flicker in Boone's gaze before he looked away. They thought they had cornered him. What they didn't realize was that Eli had been living in corners his whole life, and he had learned to sharpen them. He had waited all day, moving quiet through the fields, checking sight lines, marking distance. He didn't build booby traps. This wasn't a war zone, not yet. But he knew the terrain better than any man who'd ever come up that road. He knew where the old irrigation pipe made a clean line of sight between the barn and the gate, where the woods opened into a natural funnel, where the shadows cast by the silo swallowed a man whole after sunset. Eli had paced it out like a chessboard he'd carved in his sleep. He memorized where the dry leaves cracked loudest and where the hog wire fence sagged just enough to trip a man if he wasn't watching his feet. He didn't need reinforcements. He just needed patience and clarity. And so, when they came, under the cloak of midnight and cowardice, they came into a trap they didn't know they were walking into. The vehicles shut off 200 yards from the house, parking just past the tree line where the gravel gave way to tall grass. The farm swallowed the sound quickly, but Eli was already listening. He heard the rustling, the low voices, the heavy boots trying not to crunch under branches that had been there longer than any of them had been alive. There were more this time, at least 8 by his count. They spread out wide, flanking the property like they were playing at being professionals, but their formation was sloppy. They called out to each other in hushed curses, some carrying pistols, one with a shotgun slung too loose over his shoulder. One of them wore a mask. The rest hadn't even bothered. That's how sure they were. A man on the left flank stumbled over the corner post of the goat pen and let out a string of swears. Another behind the barn bumped into a rake Eli had intentionally left leaning against the wall. It clattered loudly before being silenced by a hissed warning. Eli had already taken position beside the old silo, prone with his rifle settled in the crook of a hay bale stacked long ago and never moved. From here, he had a clean view of the yard, the porch, the front gate, and the shadows beyond. His finger rested lightly against the trigger. His breathing slowed. And then it happened. A lighter flicked near the coop. Careless. Foolish. The brief flame revealed a young man clutching a Molotov cocktail, holding it too close to his own chest, the gasoline sloshing in the glass bottle. He was grinning, teeth bright, eyes dead. The boy pulled his arm back. Eli exhaled through his nose, centered the scope, and squeezed. The crack of the rifle tore through the night like a starter's pistol, and the bottle shattered mid-air, bursting into a fireball that lit up the yard. The boy went down in a heap of fire and shrieks, writhing and clawing at the grass. The flames licked his shirt and spread across the dry patches of straw near the edge of the coop. For a half-second, everything was frozen. Then came the chaos. "Get down! He's shootin'! Where's it comin' from?" Panic detonated in their ranks. One man near the trough dove for cover behind the rusted plow, returning wildfire with a pistol that barked at the wrong direction. Another tried to move to the barn's side wall for cover, shouting for someone to circle left. Eli shifted, not fast but smooth, lined up the next target. A tall man in a red cap, shotgun half raised, and fired. The slug caught him center mass, folding him backward over a low fence post, like a rag doll tossed by an angry hand. A third man tried to dart across the clearing near the broken-down tractor. Eli grazed him on the upper arm, snapping his shoulder back and dropping him to the ground with a panicked yell. Blood followed him like a trail marker as he dragged himself behind a crate. The rest scattered. Some retreated into the trees. Some dropped their weapons and bolted for the vehicles. One crouched by the barn, hands trembling so bad he couldn't reload. The sound of footsteps thudding against the earth, of breath coming too fast, of someone crying quietly behind the silo. It all poured in around Eli like a broken orchestra, out of tune and out of time. He didn't move from his position. He didn't call out. He didn't gloat. He just reloaded, one slow click at a time. When a bullet smacked into the hay bale a foot from his elbow, Eli barely flinched. He rolled behind the cover of the silo, unhurried, then angled to a second position. He crouched behind the rain barrel, watched as one of the gang tried to pull the wounded man to his feet. Eli didn't fire this time. He let them run. He wanted them to feel it. Not just the danger, but the helplessness, the uncertainty, the realization that this old man wasn't some relic guarding memories. He was a weapon, a sentinel forged by war and tempered in peace, and they had tried to burn down something sacred. So now they were the ones burning, but not all of them had run. One of them had guts, or just no sense. Eli spotted movement near the chicken wire. Slow, calculated. A figure crawling low, pressed flat to the dirt, trying to flank right. The man thought he was being clever, using the shadows to conceal his approach. Eli recognized the tactic. It was military, sloppy, but trained. Not one of the usual street punks. This one had done time in uniform, maybe just enough to believe he could handle a man like Eli. He waited until the crawler was within range of the old wagon wheel, half buried in tall grass, then stood quickly from the rain barrel and leveled his rifle. "Stand up," Eli called, voice flat but carrying. The man froze, still on his belly. "I said stand up. You and I both know what happens next, if you don't." There was a long pause. Then, the figure rose slowly to a crouch, rifle lowered but still in hand. "You a good shot, old man?" the voice called, young, brash, hiding fear behind defiance. Eli didn't blink. "I don't ask that question unless I already know the answer." The man hesitated, shifting his weight. "I'm just here to do a job," the guy said, trying to sound casual, like he wasn't sweating through his shirt. Eli lowered his aim just a fraction. "And what exactly is that job? Burning down homes? Killing livestock? Teaching children fear?" The man didn't reply. His fingers twitched on the grip of his weapon. Eli's tone didn't rise, didn't harden. It sank, slow and deliberate. "You're standing on the land of a man who gave up blood and bone for people he never met. You think that kind of man's afraid to take you down if it means protecting what's his?" Still silence. And then the man dropped his weapon. It hit the ground with a dull thud. "I didn't know about the animals," he muttered, stepping back, hands raised. "I swear I didn't. They told me it was just intimidation. Break a few windows, spray a wall. I didn't sign up for that." Eli didn't lower the rifle. "You chose to walk onto this land tonight. That was your answer before you said a word." The man turned and ran. No glance back, no goodbye. Eli let him go. That one wouldn't be coming back. He'd seen something tonight he hadn't expected. A man who didn't need numbers to win a fight. But others weren't so easily rattled. Another shot cracked from the far tree line, pinging off the side of the water trough with a metallic snap. Eli ducked back behind the rain barrel and shifted again, moving with a purpose that only men who had survived firefights understood. This wasn't a battle of brute force. It was strategy, patience, pressure. He worked his way around the edge of the barn, careful not to silhouette himself against the moonlight. A voice echoed from the trees. "You don't get to win, Briggs. You hear me?" It was Crowder. Angry now. Not just about failure, about being embarrassed. That's what men like him feared most. Not death, humiliation. Eli crept along the barn wall, hand slipping to the sidearm holstered on his hip. He counted the shots fired earlier. 3 left in the rifle. A full clip in the pistol. "Enough," Crowder shouted again. "You think this ends here? This doesn't end with you sitting in a rocking chair, telling stories to some kid. We're coming back. You hear me? You're finished." Eli smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just enough to show that some part of him had been waiting for that kind of talk. The enemy declaring the end before the fight was over. Always a mistake. From inside the barn, another figure moved. One of the stragglers, maybe thinking he could outflank the old man. Eli ducked low, pushed the barn door open just enough to slide in, and disappeared into the shadows. The man inside didn't see it coming. Eli moved like smoke between rafters and crates. Every step deliberate, every sound swallowed by the straw-covered floor. The man turned at the last second, shotgun raised just as Eli's pistol found its mark. "Don't." The word stopped him cold. Eli stepped into a shaft of moonlight bleeding through the broken upper window, the pistol steady in both hands. "You think, because I'm old, I won't pull this trigger?" he said, eyes locking with the man's. "I pulled one when I was 23. to save a child under a burning hut. I pulled another at 37 in a jungle where the trees bled. Don't think I won't pull it now, for the land that buried my wife and raised your future victims. The shotgun dropped. Eli kicked it aside and marched the man out by the collar. He let him run, too, but not before memorizing his face. Outside, the fire near the coop had died to glowing embers, smoke curling upward into the branches. The gang was gone. What remained was fear, not Eli's, but theirs, and the silence, deep and final, that followed every lost battle. Eli holstered his weapon, moved to the porch, and sat with his rifle across his knees once more. The rocking chair creaked softly in the wind. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But for the first time in days, he closed his eyes and rested. 3 days passed since the gunfight, and the farm held a silence that felt earned, though it was not peaceful. The kind of silence that follows a storm, not relief, but a watchful calm, as if the ground itself remembered the echo of gunfire. Eli didn't fix the barn door. He didn't repaint the slur. He left it there, a scar not just to remind him, but to show the world what had happened and what kind of men had done it. He spent the mornings walking the property with Samson at his side, checking for signs of return. Broken branches, tire tracks, cigarette butts too fresh to be his. The gang hadn't come back, not yet, but he could feel them circling, trying to decide whether fear outweighed pride. He knew the answer wouldn't stay buried long. When he finally came into town, it was to buy seed and dog food. His old pickup rattled down Main Street past storefronts that hadn't changed in 30 years. The bakery still carried the same hand-painted sign. The barber shop still had the same pole, half-rusted and spinning in the wind. But the eyes on the street felt different now. Conversations dipped in volume when he passed. Heads turned. Some nodded with quiet respect. Others didn't look at him at all. He parked by the hardware store and stepped out, joints stiff but movement still steady. Inside, he moved through the narrow aisles, head low, focused, until a voice called out behind him. "Mr. Briggs?" He turned. A man stood near the seed rack, tall, early 40s, with a kind of presence that didn't demand space so much as quietly command it. Olive skin, clean cut, dark button-down tucked into jeans, like he hadn't completely shaken the city from his wardrobe. The moment Eli looked at him, the recognition lit the man's face. "You probably don't remember me. Daniel Cruz. My kids came out to your place last fall. Mattie and Jules. They wouldn't stop talking about it for weeks, especially that goat who kept stealing hats." Eli's brow lifted slightly, something behind his eyes softening. "The girl in the purple rain boots?" Cruz grinned. "That's Jules. She's still got the feather she found by your coop. Calls it her lucky charm. They've been asking me when the farm's opening again. I told them we'd check back after the heat broke." The smile that had begun to edge onto Eli's face faded almost as quickly as it came. He looked away for a moment, toward the sunlight slanting through the store's front window. "It's not opening this year." Cruz frowned, head tilting just slightly. "Something happen?" There was a long pause. Eli studied the floor, then looked back at Cruz, his voice low but level. "They came for the animals. Tore through the pens at night. Every stall's empty now. Killed them for nothing but a message. Painted hate on my barn like they thought it'd make me crawl." Cruz's face went still. Not blank, not confused. Still, in the way a man's expression goes when gears shift quietly inside. "Who?" he asked. Eli hesitated only a second. "Boone. Or someone working under him. They sent a gang, first to offer money, then to send threats. And when that didn't work, they came back with fire and guns." Cruz breathed in through his nose, slow and controlled, and gave a short nod like he'd been expecting the name to surface. He's been dancing around federal violations for the past 3 years. Tax schemes, fraudulent zoning permits, pushing locals off their land by making the conditions unbearable. We've tried to pin him down, but he slips the net every time. Local PD won't touch him. Eli studied him, eyes narrowing just a hair. "And what exactly do you do, Mr. Cruz?" Cruz reached into his back pocket and flashed his credentials. Federal badge, clear and clean. "Senior agent. I've been circling this mess for months, but this is the first time we've had someone with the courage to stand still." There was no gratitude in Eli's face, just that same carved-in determination, the same quiet fire that had been burning since the night he found the barn empty. "I'm not looking to be part of anyone's case file," Eli said. "I want them out. Not tomorrow. Not after court hearings. Gone." Cruz didn't flinch. "Then let me help you do it right. If we move too fast, too loud, we'll blow it before we can build anything that sticks. But if we work together, we can bring the whole thing down. Boone, the muscle, the paper trail, all of it." Eli glanced over Cruz's shoulder toward the front of the hardware store, where the clerk behind the counter had stopped pretending to dust, and now stood motionless, listening. Outside, 2 women passed by the window with shopping bags in hand. One of them, a regular at the Saturday market, caught Eli's eye and quickly looked away, murmuring something too quietly for anyone else to hear. "That used to be a place folks smiled," Eli said, voice even. "Now they cross the street before I get within 30 feet of 'em. I saw a kid, one of the boys who used to spend hours feeding the goats. His mama jerked him away like I was some kind of danger. Folks don't come out and say it, but you can feel it in their bones. Like I brought the trouble on myself." Cruz didn't interrupt. "They're soft whisperin' around town, stirring their little stew pots," Eli went on, his tone edged but not bitter, just tired. "All of a sudden, it's not Eli runs that good-hearted farm for the kids. It's poor Eli's not quite right anymore. Like I'm slipping. Like the man who dug graves for 27 animals with his bare hands must have imagined the blood too." He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "They're already building their story. Sheriff's pretending I'm unstable. Rumors say I imagined half of it. Same people who used to drop their kids off at the gate won't even meet my eyes anymore." Cruz looked out the window toward Main Street, where 2 men in lawn chairs had been watching through the glass before quickly turning their heads, pretending to admire the clouds. He sighed. "Boone's working the local press. Quiet donations. Whisper campaigns. He wants you isolated before he moves again." Eli's voice was a low growl now. "Let him come back." "I'm not finished." Cruz raised a hand, not to hush, but to steady. "And neither am I. I'm going to run interference with local law, push through every roadblock I can find. But I need you to be careful, Eli. We can't let him provoke you into something reckless. That's what they want." Eli gave the faintest shrug. "Reckless left me in 72. I'm just defending what's mine." Cruz exhaled and looked him dead in the eye. "Then let's start tonight." And just like that, the fight changed. It wasn't just a war for land anymore. It was a reckoning. Not one fought in shadows or on front lawns, but in files, in cameras, in pressure applied precisely where rot had long been allowed to grow. Eli didn't ask for protection. He asked for justice. And now, he wasn't standing alone. The sky hung heavy over the fields the next day, clouds thick with the kind of weight that promised rain but didn't deliver it. Eli stood near the fence line, the earth dry beneath his boots, and looked out across the stretch of land that had once teemed with life. It was quieter now, still stripped bare of the motion and warmth it had offered for years. But the silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like tension drawn tight, a calm before something deliberate and sharp. Behind him, Cruz's car sat with both doors open, a laptop humming softly on the passenger seat. They had set up camp at the edge of the barn, away from the house, using folding chairs and a makeshift table salvaged from Eli's tool shed. Cruz tapped through files with a quiet precision, phone pressed to his ear as he spoke low and fast into it, asking for records, calling in favors, weaving through red tape like a man who had grown up fighting it. He had been at it since sunrise. Eli brought out a tin of coffee, black and thick, and handed it over. Cruz took it with a nod, eyes never leaving the screen. "I've been digging into Crowder's crew," he said after a beat. "Two of the men you spotted during the attack have sealed juvenile records. One's got a history of assault, and the fourth, well, on paper, he's a model citizen, works at a local scrapyard, goes to church. But when you start pulling threads, the same names come up. Same bar they drink at. Same lawyer shows up when they get caught with unregistered weapons, and every charge vanishes before it sticks." Eli sipped from his own mug, watching a hawk circle lazily over the far tree line. "They're ghosts until you catch them in the act," Cruz continued, more to himself now. "And even then, the system's set up to look the other way." "They got help," Eli said, not as a question, but a confirmation. "Crowder's not clever enough to hide all those footprints on his own." "No, he isn't," Cruz agreed. "But Boone is. Crowder's just the muscle. Boone's the one pulling strings in rooms most folks never get invited into." Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded envelope. It was worn and creased, the corners soft from handling. He laid it on the table and slid it across. Cruz raised a brow, but said nothing as he opened it. Inside were 3 pages, blueprints printed in faded ink, stamped with a development company logo, and marked with red pen in a shaky hand. Parcel boundaries were highlighted, including the Briggs farm, circled twice in black. "Phase 1 of Windswept Trails Family Retreat," the paper read, in the kind of font developers loved. Clean, hopeful, insincere. "That letter came with a check," Eli said, watching Cruz's eyes scan the page. "Didn't cash it. Never will. Figured I'd keep the papers, though. Proof matters more than pride." Cruz didn't say anything right away. His fingers tapped the blueprint rhythmically as he stared at the circled land, a crease forming between his brows. "This matches what I've seen in the northern counties. Boone's resort plans always follow the same pattern. He floods landowners with offers, applies zoning changes before the ink's dry, then uses pressure to push out the ones who don't sell. The pressure looks different depending on where you are. Sometimes it's code violations, sometimes it's trespassing, sometimes it's fear." "And mine?" Eli asked, his voice even. Cruz looked up. "You're the last holdout. They've already broken ground on the north side. You're the only parcel between them and the lakeshore access." Eli let that sit for a moment. The hawk above had drifted closer now, wings spread wide in still air. "You could leave," Cruz added carefully. "Take these papers, file a civil suit, get the FBI to build a case around the pattern. It'd take time, but there's a path. You wouldn't have to stay in the middle of this." Eli's head tilted, not in doubt, but disbelief. He leaned forward, arms resting on the table, and looked Cruz straight in the eye. "You think I'm going to leave the bones of my animals in the ground while those boys turn this place into a playground for weekend campers? You think I'm going to let them walk my wife's garden to park RVs while their kids sip lemonade on top of soil she bled into? No, I won't run from cowards with dirty money." Cruz didn't argue. He just nodded, slowly, like a man who knew a line when it was drawn in stone. "Then we do it here," he said. "I'll get surveillance, build an evidence trail. I've got 2 agents who owe me favors in internal affairs, and I'll start pressing the feds for warrants. It's not fast, and it's not flashy, but it'll hold." Eli looked toward the barn, where the spray-painted slur still cut across the wood. It had faded some in the sun, but not enough to forget. He stood, stretching his back with a quiet groan, and walked toward the porch. "I got a name for every goat that died, every chicken. That cow, the last one. She came when I called her. Some things you don't get back. But what you do with the loss, that's where a man's story gets written." Cruz stood as well, folding the blueprints and placing them carefully into a file folder. "And you've still got a few chapters left," he said. Eli paused at the porch steps. "That's the plan." And behind him, as the wind shifted east and the hawk circled once more, the war for the land began to change its shape, from blood and fire to strategy and truth. And Eli, the soldier-turned-farmer, prepared to fight a different kind of battle, one that would strike not just at Boone's hired hands, but at the very foundation beneath his empire. Boone didn't like the word no, not when it was spoken with conviction, and especially not when it echoed back from a man too old to be afraid. Eli's refusal had bruised more than his plans. It had bruised his ego. And men like Boone didn't lick their wounds in private. They sent someone else to finish the work. Crowder was waiting on the edge of town the following evening, seated in a pickup with one arm draped casually over the wheel, the other curled around a folded printout of the Briggs property. His orders weren't written, but they didn't need to be. He'd been told to make the problem disappear, and Boone had never been the type to ask for clarification once blood was in the water. What happened next wouldn't be subtle, and it wouldn't look like business. It would look like the kind of ending that buried truth with the man who held it. Cruz got the word just in time. One of his contacts, an analyst buried in a zoning office who'd been following Boone's development patterns, pinged him late that night. The report was clear. Surveillance suggested Crowder had begun recruiting outside town. Names tied to old militia networks, mercenaries with no flags and no loyalty. The plan wasn't pressure anymore. It was elimination. By the next morning, Cruz had Eli packed up and off the farm. It wasn't a dramatic exit. No flashing lights or last-minute standoffs. Just an old man loading a duffel into the back of Cruz's government-issued SUV and watching his porch disappear behind a veil of rising dust. They didn't speak much on the drive, and what little was said stayed fixed on strategy. Safe houses, phone protocols, who to trust. The motel Cruz chose sat on the edge of the county line, sandwiched between a truck stop and a diner that served coffee too strong and pie too sweet. It wasn't much, but it had thick curtains, a second exit, and a manager who didn't ask questions when Cruz flashed his badge and paid in cash. Eli took the room key and nodded once. "I'll be back tomorrow," Cruz said, hand on the doorframe. "We've got work to do." But that night, work paused. Sometime past sundown, a soft knock came at the motel door. Not the kind of knock that came from danger. No urgency, no threat. Just a small rhythm, hesitant and waiting. Eli opened it slowly and looked down. Tommy, the neighbor boy from up the road, maybe 7. Barely tall enough to reach the doorknob. In one hand, he held a small bundle wrapped in a checkered cloth. In the other, a block of wood, roughly the shape of a cow, its sides carved with jagged, careful effort. Eli stared for a long second before stepping aside. Tommy walked in with the reverence of someone entering a chapel. He placed the cloth bundle on the table, unwrapping it to reveal a peanut butter sandwich and a bruised apple. "I brought you lunch," he said, even though it was well past dinner time. Eli's throat tightened. He nodded toward the carving. "Who's that?" Tommy didn't hesitate. "Lady B." The name landed with more force than Eli expected. He reached out, took the carving, and turned it slowly in his hands. It wasn't perfect. The legs were uneven, the horns just little nubs, but it was unmistakably made with love and memory. "I miss her," Tommy added quietly, voice barely above a whisper. Eli swallowed hard, then crouched to eye level. "So do I." They sat there a while, no more words exchanged, just quiet understanding. Meanwhile, Cruz had been busy turning the screws. The next morning, he moved through town like a shadow, knocking on doors with a different kind of badge. He visited landowners on the south side, farmers, retired couples, small business owners, and asked pointed questions about Boone. At first, most deflected, claiming ignorance or offering practiced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. But little by little, the truth started to shake loose. A woman who ran a roadside nursery admitted her deliveries had been delayed for weeks after refusing a buyout. A man with a pasture near the lake said he'd found his barn burned 3 months ago, but the fire report had vanished before the insurance company could file. A beekeeper, silent at first, finally handed Cruz a letter he'd received marked with Boone's development office with "Confidential" stamped in the corner and no return address. Every one of them told Cruz the same thing. They'd been warned not to speak. Not by name. Not in public. But the message had been clear. Sell quietly or regret it loudly. Cruz logged every detail, every confession. He took statements, photographs, and copies of permits that looked forged, signatures that didn't match. The case was starting to take shape. Not just one man's loss, but a pattern of systemic coercion disguised as progress. But every step forward came with resistance. Sheriff Weller dragged his feet on document requests, claimed the department's computer system had errors. Files Cruz had personally submitted disappeared from the queue. A warrant request for surveillance data sat unsigned on a desk for 2 days, with no explanation other than pending review. Then came the meeting with Cruz's supervisor, a conference call full of clipped formalities and institutional caution. "You're stretching your jurisdiction," the supervisor said. "This isn't what we assigned you to." "I know what I'm seeing," Cruz replied. "What you're seeing is a complicated local matter with potential civil implications, not federal." Cruz's jaw tightened. "Boone's laundering funds through shell developments. He's using criminal intimidation to secure land transfers. He's bribed local law enforcement. That's federal." The supervisor sighed. "Daniel, I'm telling you as a professional and as a friend. Don't get personally invested." Cruz stared at the screen for a moment, then closed his laptop without responding, because it was already too late for that. He drove back to the motel that evening, pulled into the lot, and found Eli sitting outside the room in a worn metal chair, carving something of his own. The wooden Lady B sat on the windowsill behind him. "You get anything?" Eli asked without looking up. Cruz nodded. "Enough to rattle him. Not enough to stop him. Not yet." Eli looked off into the distance, where the sun dipped low and turned the motel sign gold. "Then we keep going." And as the heat of the day faded and the lights blinked on one by one along the road, the lines between law and justice grew thinner, and the men standing between them steadied for the storm that hadn't yet broken. The cemetery sat on the hill just beyond the tree line, where the town gave way to pasture and wind. No gates, no manicured paths, just a small clearing where the grass grew a little wilder, and the silence felt a little older. Eli came in the early morning before the heat gathered, before the world stirred awake. He brought nothing but his hat, his hands, and a slow, steady walk worn into his bones from years of keeping pace with ghosts. He stopped at the 3rd row, 2nd stone from the end. Marlene Briggs, beloved wife, born during war, buried in peace. The stone was simple, no scripture, just her name, and a single line carved beneath it, soft as a whisper. She grew what others forgot to love. Eli crouched slowly, one knee pressing into the damp earth. He reached forward and brushed away a curl of dry leaves from the base of the headstone. His fingers moved with quiet reverence, like he was afraid to wake her. "I thought I left all this behind," he murmured. "The fear, the fire, the way a man becomes something else just to survive." He paused, jaw clenched. But they dragged it back. Didn't ask, didn't warn, just tore it open like it was never closed. He stayed there a long moment, hat against his chest, as the wind shifted and carried the scent of pine across the field. And then, without warning, he was somewhere else. The sound of helicopters buzzed in the distance. The jungle air was thick with heat and smoke, the leaves trembling from nearby mortar fire. His boots sank into wet red clay as he pulled a man across the jungle floor, the soldier's leg twisted, face pale. Gunfire cracked through the trees like brittle branches snapping overhead. Eli's hands gripped the webbing on the man's vest. Teeth gritted as he pushed past exhaustion and rage and the sickening twist in his gut that came from carrying someone else's last breath on your back. He remembered the taste of mud, the sting of sweat, the feel of his weapon slung across his chest as he refused to let go. The jungle faded. The grave returned. He stood slowly, muscles aching in ways they hadn't in years, and touched the top of the stone with a hand that had steadied rifles, healed gardens, and now trembled just slightly. "I'll finish this," he said, barely above a breath. "I'll see it done." By mid-morning, Cruz was back in town. He had made a choice not to keep things quiet anymore. There was no value in shadows now. Not when the man on the other side had built his empire in daylight, cloaked in smiles and signatures. He found Boone standing outside the bank, pressed suit, tailored arrogance, talking to a local developer like he was already laying the foundation for a future that didn't include anyone who couldn't afford the buy-in. Cruz didn't wait for the man to finish his conversation. "Boone," he said, voice loud enough to draw heads. The developer stepped back. Boone turned with the kind of smile meant for stage lights and camera flashes. "Agent Cruz," he said smoothly, eyes cool behind his sunglasses. "I hear you've been snooping through my affairs. I hope it's all above board." "Let's not play dumb," Cruz replied, stepping closer. "You're threatening landowners, bribing local law, and orchestrating a development campaign with criminal leverage. It's not a matter of if we bring charges. It's when." Boone chuckled, the sound casual but hollow. "You'll never touch me," he said, tone dipping slightly, the grin faltering just a breath. "You think paperwork's going to shield you from what's coming? You think your badge scares me? I've buried better men than you in press conferences and handshakes." "Then you've never met someone like me," Cruz replied evenly. They stood there, still, as town traffic rolled by and people pretended not to watch. Boone leaned forward just enough to speak low. "You're overstepping. You don't know how deep this runs. You don't know how many hands are in this soil." Cruz didn't move. "I know who planted the rot, and I'm coming for the roots." Back at the motel that evening, Eli paced. He had heard about the confrontation. Small towns didn't keep secrets well. Someone had seen Boone flinch. Someone else had seen Cruz with his jaw set tight, his hands still. Eli wanted to believe it meant something, that it mattered. But every time he tried to trust the process, the same itch crept into his chest, the one that said, "Waiting got men killed." He sat at the edge of the motel bed, fingers wrapped tight around the grip of a Colt .45 he hadn't touched in 15 years. It had weight, memory, a silence of its own. "I can end this," he muttered to himself. A bullet in Crowder, a warning to Boone, and the rest scatters like rats in a flood. He stood, walked to the dresser, and opened the drawer where he kept the old field knife and the photographs Cruz had taken. Evidence stacked in black and white, waiting for a judge who might never see them. The door opened behind him. "Cruz." "Don't," he said simply. Eli didn't turn. "How long we supposed to wait?" "How long before someone else gets dragged into this?" "As long as it takes to do it right. They're not playing by the rules." Cruz stepped closer, his voice quieter now. "If you move first, we lose. If you fire that weapon, they call it escalation. You become the man they're already trying to paint you as." Eli turned then, slow and controlled. His eyes were fire, but his hands didn't move. "You ever feel like the rules were never written for you in the first place?" "All the time," Cruz replied. "But the only way we win is if we show the world we're not the villains they're waiting for. You pull that trigger, they bury the story with the bullet." The silence between them was thick. Finally, Eli lowered the weapon, placed it back in the drawer, and closed it softly. "Then, we do it your way," he said, voice low but steady. "But if they come through my door again?" Cruz nodded. "Then they chose the wrong man to corner." As the sun sank behind the motel roof, the two men sat in silence, the distance between their methods bridged by a shared purpose. The war wasn't over. But now, it was righteous. Rain came hard that morning, not in the soft rhythm the farm was used to, but in a sudden downpour that beat against the motel roof like fists demanding entry. Eli sat by the window, watching rivulets race down the glass. The wooden carving of Lady B still rested on the sill, and his coffee had gone cold in his hand. He had just stood to refresh it when the knock came. Not like Tommy's knock. This one was sharp, measured, official. Before he could speak, the door opened and two uniformed officers stepped in, followed by the motel manager with his eyes wide and mouth already moving. "They said it was urgent, Mr. Briggs. I didn't—" One of the officers cut him off. "Elijah Briggs, we have a warrant for your arrest. You need to come with us." Eli didn't flinch. He turned toward the officers, steady as ever. "What's the charge?" The taller one held up a clear evidence bag, thick with plastic-wrapped bundles of white powder and a pistol Eli had never seen before. "Possession with intent to distribute. Illegal firearm. Found under the mattress and in the closet of this room during an anonymous tip search." Eli stared at the bag. It might as well have been dipped in mud and blood and greed. "You know, that's not mine." "We don't make that call," the officer replied. "We just follow the process." Cuffed, he was led out into the rain, head held high. He didn't resist, didn't speak, didn't beg. He knew what this was, a final move by a man who couldn't break his will, so he tried to erase his name instead. But the storm Boone sent was met by a man already weathered by far worse. It didn't take long for Cruz to get the call. His contact inside dispatch tipped him off the second Eli's name hit the system. By the time Eli was in the back of the cruiser, Cruz was already tearing down the highway, lights flashing, coat whipping in the wind as he sprinted up the courthouse steps. The judge hadn't even signed the initial charge document by the time Cruz burst into the clerk's office, federal warrant in hand. It wasn't just a request. It was an order, one tied to an active investigation signed off by two higher-ups who had finally caught on that Boone's reach extended beyond the usual whispers and handshakes. Cruz stormed into the station, dripping wet and furious. He shoved the papers into the desk sergeant's hands. "Release him! Now!" The sergeant stammered. "We already filed." "Then unfile it. Those drugs weren't his." "My team's been tracking Boone's operations, and I have 3 sealed affidavits proving that motel staff were paid off by Crowder's men the day before the bust." "And that gun?" "It came from a stash we traced back to a warehouse in Montgomery, owned by one of Boone's subsidiaries." Eli, calm even in holding, looked up as Cruz entered the room. The officer on duty had already unlocked the cuffs. Cruz handed him a dry towel. "You cut it close," Eli said, with the faintest ghost of a smile. "They're desperate now," Cruz replied. "That's when mistakes start piling up." And sure enough, the mistakes were already surfacing. Later that afternoon, under a dark sky and the buzz of humming fluorescents, the FBI swept into the outskirts of town with unmarked vans and a search warrant that sliced through Boone's veneer like a scalpel. They hit 3 locations, one known as Crowder's Hangout, one of Boone's supply depots hidden behind a construction front, and a so-called storage site registered to a shell company with no staff and no signage. Inside, they found what they'd been chasing for weeks: weapons, crates of them, tucked into false panels in shipping containers. Extortion records, names of landowners with notes beside them. Soft target. Needs pressure. Offer again, bites hunter threat. Bank transfers routed through Cayman accounts. Surveillance logs. And in one folder, copies of deeds changed without consent. Forged signatures still wet in places. Boone hadn't just been playing a dirty game. He'd built an empire on intimidation, fraud, and violence. And now, the walls were closing in. Eli was released before sunset. Out on bond, but not bound by shame. His name wasn't clear yet, but it was no longer buried. By the next morning, he was back on the farm. The barn stood weather-beaten but tall, its battered door hanging like a tired sentinel waiting for orders. The slur painted across its front was faded, but the memory burned brighter than ever. He walked the property in silence, Samson beside him, mud sucking at his boots. And then came the sound of voices. Young ones. Laughter. 2 weeks before the farm officially reopened, Tommy arrived first, tugging a red wagon behind him filled with paint cans and brushes. Behind him were 3 more kids from town, faces Eli recognized from the days when Saturdays were filled with life. One of them held a bucket of water, another a sandwich wrapped in foil. "We're here to help," Tommy said. "Mama says you're the only man who didn't sell." Eli looked at the paint, the brushes, the hopeful eyes staring back at him. "Then let's get started," he said. They scrubbed the door clean, peeled back the ugliness with each stroke of soapy water. Then they painted it fresh, barn red, rich and warm. The slur was gone. In its place, Tommy dipped a brush and painted a small white flower under the window, crooked but proud. By dusk, the sky stretched wide above the barn like a curtain lifted for a second act. And on the front page of the Pinefield Weekly Gazette, a headline sat bold in black ink: "The Man Who Wouldn't Sell." The article told the truth about the attacks, about the evidence, about the man who had once served his country and now stood alone on the front lines of something quieter, but just as sacred. He hadn't picked this war. But he wasn't walking away from it either. Boone had never been the kind of man to sit still once things started turning against him. He'd built his fortune by moving early, moving fast, and making sure he was already 2 towns away by the time the ground caved in behind him. So when the headlines started shifting, when whispers became questions, and those questions began circling back to his name, he did what he always did. He packed his bags. His people said it was a business retreat, that he needed to focus on expansion opportunities, that this climate was no longer suitable for innovation. But the truth was clearer than any press release. Boone was running, not because he feared a fight, but because he'd never once stayed long enough to see one through. What he hadn't expected was how fast Cruz moved once the leash came off. The moment the warrant landed, signed, sealed, and backed by federal teeth, Cruz shifted gears. No more quiet interviews, no more late-night note-taking, or waiting on hesitant whistleblowers. This was a full operation now, a coordinated push to bring Boone and his entire infrastructure down before he could vanish into another name, another state, another shell company. Cruz made the call to Eli that same night. "You said you weren't done," he said over the phone, Then suit up. We start tonight. They met under the barn's eaves, moonlight slipping through the roof's cracked slats. The kids had gone home hours earlier, their laughter still clinging to the walls like the scent of paint and sawdust. The barn, now bright and new, stood like it had been waiting for this moment, not as a shelter, but a place of return. Cruz came with gear, targets, a folding table, a fresh Glock, and a vest Eli waved off with a grunt. "Too tight," Eli said, adjusting the strap. "Feels like I'm wrestling a snake." "You're used to heavier firepower," Cruz replied. "I'm used to people shooting back." They set up in the pasture beyond the silo, just past the garden where Marlene's roses had started blooming again. Eli paced the ground like he was walking an old battlefield, scanning shadows, noting high ground, soft soil, and the sound of the wind brushing over distant trees. "You ever miss it?" Cruz asked, watching him. Eli didn't answer right away. He lifted the rifle, aligned his shoulder, and fired. 3 shots, tight grouping, just right of center. "I miss clarity," he finally said. "In war, you know who the enemy is. In towns like this, they smile while they stab." He handed the rifle to Cruz, who took it with quiet respect. The next few nights played out the same. Cruz came after hours, and Eli taught him how to move without sound, how to read light and wind, how to shoot not to impress, but to survive. They spoke less with words and more with weight. There was something sacred in the quiet repetition, in the way a man passed on knowledge born of fire to someone who needed it to finish a different kind of war. And the community noticed. First came the neighbor who brought a wheelbarrow full of timber. Then a family arrived with fresh eggs and tools. By the week's end, the old garden had been tilled, the fences repaired, and 3 new goats, donated by a farm 2 counties over, stood chewing lazily under the rebuilt awning. People didn't come with speeches or cameras. They came with shovels, gloves, and casseroles wrapped in foil. Some brought their kids. Others just stood silently by the barn, waiting for instruction. Eli didn't make a fuss. He just handed them work and nodded his thanks. But the tide didn't fully turn until the recording surfaced. It came from an anonymous source, likely someone who had been on the inside too long to sleep right. A thumb drive delivered to Cruz's office in a plain envelope. No note, no name, just a digital confession waiting to detonate. They played it that night in the barn, laptop propped on a hay bale, the speaker turned low. Boone's voice came through clear, arrogant, measured, unmistakable. "I don't care if it's messy. I want those animals gone. Let him wake up to blood. I want him rattled. Make sure they tag the barn. He needs to feel the fear, not just see it." There was a pause, then Crowder's voice, quieter but carrying a sneer. "And the kids?" Boone laughed. "They'll find someplace else to play. This isn't about kids. This is about leverage. Old man's holding up $1 million lakefront. Make sure he understands what that costs." The silence after the clip ended was suffocating. Cruz leaned back against the stall, eyes dark. "This is it," he said. "With this, the intimidation becomes intent. We don't just have motive, we have conspiracy. And once we bring that into court, his entire safety net collapses." Eli didn't speak for a long time. He just watched the screen, listened again to the voice of the man who had taken everything from him, and had never once said his name with respect. When he finally stood, it was with the same calm that had marked him on the battlefield and on the porch. Steady, dangerous, absolute. Then let's show him what it costs to try and scare a man who's already buried everything he loves. And as the wind rolled in across the fields and the stars rose above the barn's fresh red paint, something shifted. Not in the land, but in the air around it. The trap was no longer Boone's to set. Now it belonged to the men who had rebuilt something from ashes and were prepared to defend it. Not just with guns, but with truth, memory, and the kind of justice that didn't need applause to matter. It happened quicker than anyone expected, though for those who knew Crowder, the real surprise lay in how late it came. 27 years of bravado and lies had begun to erode under warrants, surveillance footage, and hushed doubts whispered through his own crew like poison. He showed up to meetings smelling of whiskey, fingers curling around his gun in public, as if trying to intimidate invisible opponents. That confidence, once loud and unshakable, had curdled into something brittle and dangerous. It only took one spark to ignite the whole thing. The spark came in a diner parking lot late one evening, strict fluorescent lights illuminating cracked asphalt and bruised dreams. A teenage source, bright, determined, and all too aware of the stakes, stepped out of his car, mind already rehearsing his testimony. Crowder stepped in without preamble, fist swinging before introductions were necessary, grip firm around the collar of the kid's shirt as he slammed him against the concrete wall with more venom than volume. The kid didn't scream, but his eyes went wide, eyes that had seen more courage in the wrong places. The diner windows rattled under Crowder's threat, his voice low and vicious. "You think Boone's gonna save you? Think this badge boy's gonna make you a hero?" It was a threat meant to close doors and lock secrets in the dark. Crowder only lasted 2 seconds before 2 plainclothes agents burst out of the diner, badges shining in the glare of street lamps. They tackled him hard, flat on the ground, cuffs snapping tight around rough wrists. The diner crowd watched, breath caught, as the enforcer became the enforceable. In that instant, Boone's world began to crumble. Crowder had been his shield, the one who enforced the terror. Now he was undone in public, stripped of silence and secrecy. When the arrest warrant hit the streets that evening, Boone's veneer cracked irreparably. He paced his home office like a man convinced that walls spoke faster than television, phone clenched in a damp fist as he argued with lawyers who could no longer promise delay. His breathing was heavy, the shadows under his suit, not just from expensive tailoring, but from panic sown by guilt. He still controlled enough to deliver orders, to threaten bodies and careers, but he couldn't shave another second from the ticking clock they'd all started together. That night, Boone made a different kind of call. No partners, no middlemen, just direct orders sent to the worst parts of his network. If the courts won't stop this, burn it all. No property, no home, no escape. It was a scorched earth clause. It was desperation. What he didn't realize was that Eli had already scouted the terrain. The land had been readied, every inch marked with intention. Beneath the loose boards of the porch lay pressure lines tied to silent alarms. Wires ran along the ground into hidden speakers and flashing lights. The back gate had been trapped. The barn roof held silent vantage, just waiting for movement. Soldiers aren't artists, but they know architecture when it needs to fight. As the headlights appeared at the road's bend, the heat couldn't mask the tension. Scooped low and thick, as though the fields themselves remembered each gunshot, Boone's convoy entered the tree line. Military-style weapons glinted in errant moonlight as the men spilled from their vehicles. They expected fear. They expected an old man to tremble beside his barn. Instead, the first trap triggered without warning. The speakers erupted with a tone so low and distorted it rattled the bones and froze feet in place. The floodlights snapped on, washing the field in a stark, unforgiving glare. The men staggered, confusion and adrenaline tangling into hesitation. From the tree line, Cruz's voice rang out through the speaker system, the calm before the collapse of Boone's world. "Federal agents, lay down your weapons. You are surrounded." Boone turned like a wounded animal, eyes wild, jaw clenched. His men faltered, too stunned to move. 2 dropped their rifles almost on instinct, hands slowly rising as they scanned the tree line for movement. A third tried to run. He didn't make it far before a pair of agents emerged from the high grass and tackled him hard into the dirt. But Boone didn't stop to surrender or assess. He bolted. Cruz caught the movement, but was too far to intercept. "Boone's running east." "Eli, he's headed your way." The agents gave chase, boots slicing through wet brush and mud. But Boone had always known where the fences broke, where the back of the orchard sloped down toward the pond. He ran with the desperation of a man whose fortune and power were measured in seconds, not dollars. He was almost out. Almost. But he didn't know Eli had been waiting there since sunset. Boone broke through the last row of pecan trees and stumbled into the clearing. Eli stepped forward, a silhouette framed by the glowing red of the emergency lantern he'd placed in the grass hours ago. He wasn't armed. He didn't need to be. He stood with the stillness of a mountain, something ancient and rooted too deep to move. Boone skidded to a halt, mud splashing up the sides of his slacks. His hair clung to his temples, his breath coming in shallow, angry bursts. "Get out of my way," he spat, hand reaching for the small pistol hidden in the inside of his jacket. Eli didn't flinch. "Think carefully," he said, his voice low, weathered but unshaken. "That's not a tool in your coat. That's a rope, and you're tying the knot yourself." Boone didn't listen. Men like him rarely did. He lunged. The pistol came up, but Eli had already closed the distance, grabbing Boone's wrist with a speed that belied his years. The gun fired once, wild and wide. Eli twisted Boone's arm hard, and the weapon fell into the grass. Boone growled, tried to punch, but Eli stepped inside the swing and drove his shoulder into Boone's chest, knocking him back. They grappled in the mud beneath the trees, lantern light catching on sweat and grit and fury. Boone, all brute force and ego, swung wild and heavy, aiming to overwhelm. Eli, calm and efficient, moved like a man who had fought for breath under enemy fire. Every block tight, every motion economical. Boone landed a blow across Eli's jaw, staggering him a step. "You think this makes you a hero? You think people care who you are? You're just an old man on borrowed time." Eli spit blood onto the dirt, eyes burning. "No, I'm the last line you never expected to hold." He countered with a hook that cracked against Boone's temple, followed by a knee into the ribs that sent Boone sprawling. But Boone recovered, grabbing a fistful of Eli's coat and pulling them both into a thicket, where branches clawed at them like the ghost of the farm's past, trying to pull them apart. They tumbled into a small ravine just past the orchard, landing in a shallow creek where mud and water soaked through their clothes. Boone tried to shove Eli under, snarling, his hand wrapped around Eli's throat. But Eli reached up, drove his thumb into Boone's eye socket just enough to break the hold. Boone howled and staggered back. They stood again, soaked and bleeding. Eli's chest rose and fell with the strain, but his stance never faltered. Boone's lips curled. "I'll burn this land down. I'll make sure no one ever remembers your name." Eli stepped in fast, grabbed Boone's coat lapels, pulled him in, and headbutted him with a crunch of bone. "They will, because I bled for it. And you? You just bought everything but backbone." Boone stumbled, dazed, swinging out of instinct more than aim. Eli sidestepped, caught the arm mid-swing, twisted it behind Boone's back, and slammed him against the wide trunk of the old pecan tree. Marlene's favorite. Boone groaned, sagging under the pressure. "You know what this land is?" Eli said near his ear. "It's the sound of kids laughing. It's every goat you had killed. It's my wife's roses. It's a promise I made while I held her hand as she left this world. And you thought it was just real estate?" Boone struggled, trying to break free. "But I never needed a court to tell me this land was mine." Eli released him. Boone turned, ready to lunge one last time, but he didn't get the chance. Cruz and 3 agents emerged from the woods with rifles raised, red and blue lights cutting through the trees behind them. Boone froze, fists still clenched, teeth bared like a rabid dog staring down his final reckoning. Cruz stepped forward. Game's over. And for the first time since the beginning, Boone's eyes finally held something unfamiliar. Fear that came not from losing money, but from being seen for what he truly was. A man whose cruelty had finally outlived his influence. The trial came and went with the weight of inevitability, a slow march through courtroom halls lined with news crews and tight-lipped attorneys. Boone stood in a dark suit each day, eyes hollow behind tailored arrogance, while the prosecution unraveled his empire piece by piece. The evidence was overwhelming. Fraudulent contracts, wire transfers, surveillance footage, and the damning audio of his own voice ordering the slaughter of defenseless animals. His defense team, once confident, wilted under the clarity of truth and the sheer volume of what they couldn't hide. The jury deliberated for only 9 hours. Boone was found guilty on all major counts: fraud, conspiracy to commit intimidation, obstruction of justice, bribery of public officials, and facilitating criminal activity across state lines. The sentence was handed down with no ceremony, but its weight was unmistakable. 35 years in federal prison, no chance of parole for the first 20. He didn't speak when they read the verdict. He didn't look at Eli, didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't offer denial. Whatever defiance had once lived in him had long since been drained in the soil behind the orchard, where he had lost more than a fight. He had lost control of the story, and men like Boone rarely survive the truth when it's no longer theirs to shape. Crowder, faced with a mountain of charges and the reality that Boone could no longer protect him, cut a deal. He pled guilty to multiple felony counts: assault, racketeering, witness intimidation, and aiding in criminal enterprise. His sentence came swiftly: 20 years in federal prison, with no fanfare and no visitors. He left the courthouse in shackles, head bowed, no longer swaggering, no longer dangerous, just another relic buried under the weight of consequences he had once believed only applied to other men. The dust settled slowly in Pinefield. News trucks packed up. Headlines moved on. But the real change didn't come in press conferences or court transcripts. It came in the quiet places, in tilled earth, in laughter that returned to fields once silenced by grief, in the sound of a hammer striking wood, not in destruction, but in restoration. Eli returned to the land as though it had never left him. In the days that followed the conviction, donations began arriving without prompt or plea. Checks wrapped in handwritten letters, envelopes carrying words from people across the county and far beyond. A local nonprofit organized a fundraiser. A regional farming cooperative matched every dollar raised. 1 week after the verdict, Eli was handed a grant application already approved by the state, earmarked for land preservation, youth education, and agricultural rehabilitation. He didn't speak much about the money. He spoke about the kids. The first animals arrived in a convoy of trailers and pickups. A pair of goats from a family farm 3 towns over. A small herd of sheep donated in honor of a local vet. 3 ponies gifted by a retired riding instructor who said her animals needed a place with history. There was a calf, too, brown-eyed, impossibly soft, named Sugar by Tommy himself. Volunteers helped unload them, their boots kicking up clouds of dust as laughter returned to the farmyard. Parents took pictures. Elders dropped off food and feed. The front gate, once guarded by solitude, stood open again. And by that Sunday, the first group of children, 10 in total, ran through the pastures like the land itself had been holding its breath, waiting for them to return. They fed the animals, helped plant new rows of vegetables, and listened as Eli, quiet and steady as ever, showed them how to hold a shovel, how to lead a goat, and how to listen to the sound of wind in a cornfield. He didn't need to explain what had happened to bring them back. The land explained it for him. It was Tommy who painted the new name on the barn, careful letters traced with a brush too big for his small hands. He stood on a stool, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration, while Eli held the board steady. When he finished, he stepped back, face streaked with red paint and pride. The barn door now read, Marlene's Haven. No plaque, no dedication. Just a name spoken in reverence, sealed in brush strokes, standing as a vow that what had been torn down would not only be rebuilt, it would be reimagined. Eli didn't cry, but when he walked past the barn that evening, long after the last child had gone home and the sun had dipped beneath the hill, he paused with his hand on the door. He looked up at the name, his fingers tracing the wood gently, as if it were the pages of a letter sent from another world. He didn't say her name out loud. He didn't need to. He simply stood there a moment longer than usual. Cruz visited a few days later. His jacket hung loose, and he looked tired in the way men do when they've seen something through and are only just learning how to stand still. They sat on the porch, each with a glass of iced tea. No words exchanged for the first few minutes. "You staying in town?" Eli finally asked. "Thinking about it," Cruz replied. "Lot of rot still left to clear. And besides, my kids keep asking when they can come back to feed Sugar." Eli gave a short nod, the corner of his mouth tilting ever so slightly. "She likes carrots, but not the small ones. Spoiled already." They both chuckled, quiet and real. The kind of sound you only get when peace isn't just a concept, but something you've earned, inch by inch, breath by breath, sacrifice by sacrifice. Cruz stood to leave after sunset, the sky overhead the color of ash softened by firelight. As he stepped off the porch, he paused. "You know, you could have walked away." Eli shook his head, slow and certain. "I did, years ago. But when it came walking back through that gate with blood on its boots, I knew I couldn't let it stay. They didn't shake hands. They didn't need to. Because justice, when it's done right, doesn't announce itself in a courtroom. It grows, quiet and steady, in places where hope once bled. It returns to the soil, like water after drought. It lives in the laughter of children, in the strength of memory, and in the name painted across a barn rebuilt with grace. Marlene's Haven, and it would never fall silent again. The sun rose slow and gold over the hills that morning, as if even the light knew it needed to take its time. It spilled over the fields in long, gentle ribbons, warming dew-kissed grass and the fresh coats of paint that still glistened on the barn walls. The new gate stood wide open, its hinges freshly oiled, welcoming a stream of families down the gravel path that wound through the pasture like a memory made visible. It was opening day. Not a ribbon cutting, not a ceremony. No one gave speeches. There were no microphones or officials or signs marked grand. Just the sound of children laughing, feet running, the creak of swings and the rattle of feed buckets. The same scene Eli had seen 100 times before, but today it looked different. Today it looked full. Not just of people, but of something he hadn't let himself believe in for a long time. It looked like a future. The yard bustled with motion. Parents leaned over fences to snap pictures of goats licking tiny fingers. A group of teenagers hauled straw bales into the shed without being asked. Chickens darted through rows of cabbage, while a piglet nosed curiously at someone's shoelaces. The new calf, Sugar, stood like royalty near the edge of the field, soaking in the attention of at least a dozen eager hands. Tommy stood near the pen, jaws set, with the seriousness of a boy who knew his duty. "She doesn't like the orange carrots," he informed a little girl beside him. Only the long yellow ones. And you gotta peel 'em. She's picky. Eli watched from the porch for a moment before stepping down into the crowd. His boots still found the familiar dips in the path, the soft patches where Marlene used to tell him to just level it out already, and the bend near the apple tree where Cruz had parked his truck 2 nights earlier. Cruz hadn't missed opening day. He stood near the old well pump with his son, a bright-eyed boy no older than 7, who clung to his leg before finally letting go and joining a group of kids stacking feed buckets into some kind of castle. Cruz raised a hand in greeting, his smile relaxed for the first time in weeks. "Told you they'd show up," he said as Eli approached. "They didn't show up for me," Eli replied, his tone quiet but solid. "They showed up because they remembered who they were." Cruz clapped a hand on his shoulder, the weight familiar. The silence that followed filled with something like pride. They didn't talk about the trial. They didn't mention Boone or Crowder or the sheriff, who'd quietly resigned in disgrace 2 weeks after the sentencing. There was no need. The land had a way of closing old wounds, not by forgetting, but by making space for something to grow beside them. Later that afternoon, Cruz and his son climbed onto the old red tractor with Eli behind the wheel. The engine sputtered to life with a cough, then a hum, and the tires rolled slow and easy through the south field, while kids waved from the fence line. The boy laughed every time the tractor bounced, hands high in the air like he was riding a roller coaster. Eli didn't say much as they circled back toward the barn. He just listened to the wind, the gears, the sound of life settling back into a place that had once gone still. When they returned to the porch, the boy jumped down and ran to tell his mother about the ride. Cruz lingered. "You know, I got a team coming in next month. New community task force. We could use a man like you." Eli's chuckle rumbled like gravel under boots. "I already got a team. They just happen to be 3 feet tall and really bad at pulling weeds." Cruz smiled. He didn't press. A little later, under a softening sky, Eli found Tommy near the garden rows. The boy knelt in the dirt, fists clenched, jaw tight with frustration. "Carrots won't grow," he said, not looking up. "They won't yet," Eli corrected, crouching beside him. "But they will." He took the trowel from Tommy, dug a narrow furrow with the precision of someone who'd done it thousands of times, then handed it back. "Soil's good now. You give 'em time, son, and patience. That's the part folks forget." Tommy nodded, biting his lip, and began placing the seeds. Eli stayed beside him, guiding gently, letting the boy take ownership of the process. When the row was finished, they watered it together, not speaking, just standing shoulder to shoulder as the soil darkened with promise. As evening settled across the land, the families began to leave, voices trailing into the distance, laughter lingering like a song just past its final note. One by one, the lights in the main barn dimmed. The animals bedded down, and Eli walked the field once more, not out of habit, but out of something closer to gratitude. He ended his walk beneath the rose bush, Marlene's bush. The petals were full this year, flushed with color, nodding gently in the breeze, like they too had been waiting for this moment. Eli sat down on the bench beneath it, boots caked with dust, hands folded in his lap. He leaned back against the trunk of the tree beside the bush and let his eyes close. For the first time in what felt like years, he smiled. It wasn't the smile of victory, not of triumph or revenge. It was quieter than that. It was the smile of a man who had fought for peace and finally found himself living inside it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.